Okay, hello everyone. My name is Adam Oren. I'm a developer advocate here at Google for the AdWords API, and welcome to the Google Ads API beta webinar. I just wanted to introduce myself on the screen real quick before I switch over to the slides. Um, in the chat, I have pasted a link to our question and answer session that will be on the video once I switch over to the slides. But I wanted a link there that's easy to click on for everybody. So you can find that there. I'd encourage you to open that up in another tab so I can ask questions while I go through the information here. One other thing before we get started, just some administrivia. This is our first webinar of two that I'm going to be delivering today. Here it's 9 a.m. in Singapore. I'm going to be doing another webinar at 9 p.m. tonight. It's going to be exactly the same thing. So if you're planning on tuning into both, please don't. This is the only one you need to tune into. This is just going to be a repeat later on this evening. Okay, so I think what I'm going to do now is switch on over to the slides and get started. Give me 1 second while I bring up the slides. Okie doke, here is the Google Ads API webinar, and we will get started right now. So, like I said, at the top of the slides there, that's the question and answer link. Please bring that up now if you can, then have it side by side with the video. If you come to anything in the video that you want to ask a question about, put it in there. You'll also see some questions in there. When we first announced the webinar, we had a link to pre-questions. If anybody had any questions ahead of time, I've gone ahead and put everybody's questions who submitted stuff in there. So you'll see about 7 or 8 questions in there already. You'll notice there's a thumbs up, thumbs down next to the questions. If you're going to ask a similar question, please put a thumbs up by it. That'll give sort of a count of how many people are interested in, so you know which are the most popular questions, and I will make sure to answer those. I'll answer them all, but I'll make sure to answer those and pay special attention to those since we know that everybody is interested in those. Okay, so let's get started. First of all, the agenda. What we're going to hear about today, the different things in this talk. First, I'm going to introduce the Google Ads API, explain what it is, its features, and a little bit about the beta program that we just launched. Then we're going to get into setting up API access, walk through the steps you need to go through in order to get access to the API and begin using it. Making your first call, that third step there is how you actually go about from downloading the client libraries all the way to running one of our examples and actually making a call to the library or to the API using our client libraries. This is hopefully straightforward stuff, but just want to make sure we walk through the steps and make it as easy as possible for everybody to do it. So it's to maximize everybody's chance of getting up and running as quickly as they can. Finally, we're going to walk through the API concepts. These are going to rhyme with what you know now from the AdWords API for those of you who are using the existing AdWords API. But there's significantly different in some ways, hopefully better. And we're going to go over those and just get a flavor of how the new API works, the concepts behind it, so you understand what's going on underneath the hood, so to speak. Okay, so here we go. First of all, introducing the Google Ads API. The next generation of the AdWords API is on its way. Hopefully, for a lot of people who have been using the AdWords API for a while, this is a very exciting news. You know that the existing AdWords API has been around for a long time and it's served us well. But that being said, it's based on some technologies that are a bit long in the tooth at the moment. It's a SOAP API, and I think everybody who's dealt with the AdWords API scratches their head and wonders when they can move on from the world of XML and SOAP and to a more modern, robust technological era that we live in. And I'm happy to present with the Google Ads API that day is finally here. So the Google Ads API. This is a new version of the AdWords API, the next generation of the AdWords API, based on Google's modern API architecture. This is the same architecture and infrastructure that we use to power all of our cloud-based APIs. So if you've used any of our Google Cloud systems, our Google Cloud APIs that exist in the Google Developers Console, this is the exact same technology stack and is now a first-class citizen with almost all of our other API offerings. It's based on gRPC and JSON REST and has interfaces actually to both technologies. And like I said, it's integrated directly with the Google Developer Console. So the same place you go to activate other APIs in our cloud ecosystem, where you have analytics usage, where you can enable logs, OAuth security, and all that. AdWords API is now a citizen of that ecosystem, and it's built directly in. Second major feature of the Google Ads API, we now have a unified API data model. This allows us to support complex queries using something called the Google Ads query language. Now, if you're familiar with the AdWords API, you'll know that we have the AdWords query language, which you can use to query data in the existing API. The new API is something called the Google Ads query language, which is very similar, but in certain ways, it's much more powerful. It enables you to pull metrics alongside the AdWords entities together. So that's actually a very powerful concept. We'll get into exactly what that means. But in the existing AdWords API, we have sort of two separate services, sets of services. We have services for changing and manipulating data, and then we have our reporting endpoints. And they're sort of separate things. Reporting endpoints pull down tabular data, and our current AdWords API mutate methods allow you to change things via sort of two separate ways to pull data. We've unified the data model in the Google Ads API. So now you can use the same and one unified service to query metrics, to query AdWords entity objects, and pull them down together. And the data set that you get back is a unified data model that's compatible with all the other services. So we're going to see exactly what that means later on in this deck. But I want to bring that up as front and center as one of the most significant features that you're going to get with the new API. Finally, we offer scalable data download support. We support streaming very large data sets as page data. So one of the existing bottlenecks when you use our AdWords API is when you have to pull very, very large reports. Say you're reporting on an AdWords account that maybe has tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of campaigns, and you're trying to pull tons of data, or you're trying to pull all the keywords corresponding to those campaigns. You soon get into data sets and reports that have maybe millions of rows, and that became a problem in certain scenarios when you try to pull that much data back in a single API request. The Google Ads API now supports paging for most of our services. So when you want to pull down a very, very large data set, you can tell us ahead of time how many do you want to get at a time. Say you want to get 1,000 rows of data at a time. Okay, you make a request, you get 1,000 rows. When you're ready, call us back and we'll get the next 1,000 rows. That way you can page through very large data sets and you don't have to worry about consuming extremely large downloads all at once. Okay, so that's sort of a top level overview of the big features that we're getting out of the Google Ads API. Let's talk about the beta program. So on April 23rd, we released sort of V0 of the Google Ads API into beta. Now, we've done that alongside the existing AdWords API. That was shortly after we released version 2018-02. This slide just wants to give you an idea of the roadmap going forward, and that we're going to have both APIs existing side by side for the foreseeable future into 2019. So we're going to have the Google Ads API beta program is going to continue as we release 2018-06 and version 2018-09 of the AdWords API. So while we do that, you can still use the AdWords API, and you're still going to see frequent releases from the AdWords API as usual. We'll also have the Google Ads API beta program incrementally increasing in feature set and functionality as that goes on. So just to give you an idea of how that's going to happen and iterate over time, we're slowly going to build up the features in the Google Ads API to reach feature parity with the AdWords API. We're going to do that in an incremental fashion. So what we've released now is sort of version V0 of the beta, and that has a critical set of core features to sort of get the API off the ground and allow you to use it. It's not very robust in that it does not have feature parity with the AdWords API. But a lot of things that we don't have support for, say display campaigns or shopping campaigns. I'm going to go through on a couple slides here exactly what's supported. But I want to let you know that the beta now has some core features there to have a sort of MVP version of the API that you can work with in a beta environment. The whole thing isn't there yet. So as we go through 2018 and into 2019, we're going to be releasing incremental updates to the API. So right now, if you want to call what we have V0, we may have V01, V02, V03 released, hopefully in fairly fast succession over the next few months as we go through 2018 to add new features and build out the feature support to get to finally full feature parity with the AdWords API. So we are aiming for that, and it will come, but it's going to come in incremental updates to the existing Google Ads API. So this is just to give you an idea of, don't expect all the features to be there now. We're going to be releasing V01, V02 in fairly frequent succession as the year goes on, and we'll be publishing release notes with each one, so you can get an exact idea of what is being added and when the features you may be looking for are going to be available in the beta program. Okay, so let's talk about what's actually there right now. So if you go and actually try out the beta, the V0 initial release, what do we have? Okay, first thing, we have fairly robust support for search campaigns. We have create, update, and remove for the campaigns themselves. On those campaigns, you can manage their budgets. You can also manage ad groups in search campaigns. And we support 5 different kinds of ads in each of those campaigns. We also provide support for setting both standard and shared bidding strategies. And you can also set up targeting using keywords. So basically what this is support for search campaigns using keywords for criteria. And most of the plumbing there, regarding ad groups and the ads and stuff is also there to support the full thing. You can also retrieve detailed advertiser information. So this is analogous to what you can get in the customer service of the current AdWords API. The customer data, like the account time zone, the account currency, is also there. We also have reporting on various metrics for search campaigns. So you'll be able to get impressions, clicks, conversions, and stuff like that for the search campaigns that are supported. But the key thing to take away from this is outside of search campaigns, there is not support for those objects yet. So shopping campaigns, display campaigns, things like that. And that's important to know because say you do a get from the new Google Ads API and you try to get all the campaigns in an account and say there may be 3 search campaigns, 2 display campaigns, 1 shopping campaign, you're only going to see the search campaigns because the new Google Ads API only supports the search features. So you may not get an accurate count of all the campaigns that are currently in an AdWords account using the V0 release just because we don't support anything other than search campaigns yet. But as I said, as we build out incremental support, look for that to change as we get to V01, V02 of the beta program and this initial release of the AdWords API, or the Google Ads API. Excuse me. I'm going to be saying both of those names in fairly rapid succession. I'm probably going to get confused more than once. I'm going to try not to. Try to keep them straight. Okay, so why join the beta? What are the reasons we're doing this? Well, mainly so you can stay ahead of the game. You can get a technology preview of what's coming. Mainly, you can get your products ready to support gRPC and or JSON in the REST format. This is important because we know that a lot of our developers have been aching to move off of SOAP for a long time, especially when you're dealing with new environments that weren't quite didn't exist or weren't quite ready for prime time. Way back when we rolled out a SOAP environment. If you're doing development, say in Node.js or Go or something like that, and there's not necessarily really good support for SOAP, this is a great opportunity for you to start taking a look at this newer technology stack and thinking of ways and exploring ways to integrate it with your current product. Secondly, provide feedback to our engineering team and influence the new Google Ads API. This is key, and this is super important. We're at a very nebulous stage right now. Our engineers are literally building this API as we speak. So your feedback goes a very, very long way here. We're going to have some official feedback channels, some more official feedback channels rolling out as the beta program proceeds. Right now, you can reach out to us directly. We have our resources slide at the end. It's going to show support options either through an email alias or a support forum. But we're going to have some more official feedback collection mechanisms as the beta program goes on. And we really, really encourage you to use those because, like I said, now is your time to influence the API. Let us understand what you're doing, what works, what doesn't, and we can actually make changes in flight to the API as it's being built to make sure it suits your needs. Thirdly, you can try out new features such as the Google Ads query language. Like I said, this is a very, very important feature, and it's sort of front and center on one of the ways that the new Google Ads API is so much more robust than the AdWords API. And we're encouraging everybody to try this out, see how it works, and get a flavor for how this changes your workflow and optimizes things in your product. And finally, experiment using the API to download query metrics and immediately send them back as mutates. Like I said, this is a feature, is another really good feature of the AdWords API instead of the Google Ads API versus the AdWords API. You can download reporting data from the API, and it's the same format, the same object format as our mutate method. So you can actually do a query to say, hey, give me all campaigns who have impressions and clicks in the last 30 days and their click-through rate is above 20%. And you get those campaigns back, and you can immediately set a certain attribute, say set them all to pause, and then make an API call and send them right back, instead of having to parse a downloaded CSV, reconstruct objects that represent those campaigns, and send them back to the API like you would have to do in the AdWords API. So we think this is going to be a very big productivity saver and really streamline your code if you can start using an API this way and not have to worry about consuming report data and feeding that back to the API as mutates as sort of completely separate workflows. Okay, setting up API access. Now I'm going to quickly walk through all the different steps. They're not that many, but the important steps that you have to go through to actually get access to the Google Ads API. So 3 main things you have to do. First, join the beta program. This is important because this whitelists you as a developer to get access to the API. Without joining the beta program at this point, you won't be able to actually use the API even if you enable it in the Google Developer Console. Which brings me to the second point. Enable the API in the Developer Console. Once you've joined the beta, go into the Google Developer Console where you would enable all other APIs that exist, for instance, in our Cloud API system, and enable the Google Ads API. And then finally, you want to create an OAuth client ID. This essentially provisions a credentialing mechanism for you to generate refresh or access tokens to authenticate to the API. This isn't something that's changed for the AdWords API, but now that the API lives in the Google Developer Console, this is sort of part of the setup process and needs to be done in order for the API to actually have a mechanism to credential you. So we put it here in the setup API access steps here. Okay, so real quick, joining the beta. We have a form. Here's the link. I know this is a video, makes it hard to click on a link, but we're going to be sharing these slides after the fact, so you'll be able to click on these things. But here it is anyway, developer.google.com/Google-Ads API signup-form. There's a form here with some fairly basic pieces of information, and signing up for the beta is quite literally as simple as filling out this form. It's an open beta. Anybody who wants to can fill out this form, provided you have a manager account and a developer token. I'll go into a little bit about the developer token in a few more slides. But basically just fill this out. The pieces of information here, like I said, you need your manager account, your MCC account, and your developer contact and email in the AdWords API Center needs to be up to date. This is super important, and it's literally a checkbox just to say, yes, I've done it, but it's important because we need to be able to reach out to you if we have any questions, and this is how we do it. And optionally, we ask for your programming language and your description of API usage. So this goes back to sort of the feedback I was talking about before. Please, it's optional, but if you can, fill this out. We want to know what you're doing with the API and the languages you're using so we can make sure we're providing everybody support. Okay, so you want to put in your manager account ID in the form. Click this box. Don't just click it blindly. Please, please double check that you have in the API Center in your manager account a valid email address that will work if somebody from our API team needs to reach out to you and ask you a question about what's going on. Or if we're going to reach out to you, for instance, and send a feedback form about the API, this is where we're going to do it. So please make sure this is up to date. Again, put your programming language here if you can. We're trying to gauge interest. Right now, V0 has Java, .NET, and Ruby support. We will have fast follow for other languages as well. We're not stopping there. That's just what's come out first. But we also want to, now that we're using gRPC and REST, our options are much wider than they were with SOAP. So we want to understand what languages people are coming from, gauge interest in other programming languages, and if there's huge interest for like Node.js or something, we can explore releasing a library for that. So please, please, please put it here so we know what languages you're using and what people want to be using this for. And finally, what you're using the new API for. This gives us an idea of the feature sets to prioritize and what to focus on, say, in building out our documentation. So the more information you can provide us here, the better we can make the experience for you. Okay, so enabling the API in the Google Developer Console. Once you've submitted that form, navigate over to console.developer.google.com. This is where you manage your API projects globally for the Google Cloud API ecosystem. So if you have an existing project, that's fine. You can use that. Or if you're going to be creating a new project for the Google Ads API usage, go ahead and create a new project. Once you do that, you want to search for the Google Ads API. There is a menu where you can go in API services and then click on library, and it'll bring up a screen that looks like this, and literally just type in Google Ads API in the search box. It should be the very first thing that comes up. You'll see the little AdWords logo there. Google Ads API, manage your AdWords accounts, campaigns, and reports with REST-based API. Click on that, and then make sure you click actually click the enable button, and it'll give you a little spinner saying provisioning, and then whoop, it'll be enabled, and then you will have access to the Google Ads API. Okay, the final step here in the setup process is creating a set of OAuth credentials. So you want to generate a client ID and client secret pair that allow you to generate auth tokens for your API calls. This is how we authenticate and authorize access to the AdWords API, or the Google Ads API, and similarly the AdWords API. This mechanism hasn't changed, but this is the exact same thing here, and you need to do it in order, for instance, to get our client libraries to work. You're going to need the settings that are exposed and configured here to pass to our client libraries, for example, to get them up and running. So there are 3 steps. In the developer console, select create credentials and then select OAuth ID. It's important to note that there are 2 other options here, an API key or a service account key. API key is not supported. Service account key, there is support for service accounts. However, the V0 release of the client libraries we have now does not have support for them yet. So we do not recommend experimenting and playing around right at this time with service accounts. We'll have more documentation and maybe support for that later. But right now, OAuth client ID, sorry, excuse me, is the thing you want. And then you want to click create, and it'll prompt you for an application type. There are 2 application types here supported by the Google Ads API, either the top one, web application, or installed application, which is the other option listed on the bottom. So if you're looking for installed application flow, it's actually that, it's called other. So choose that at the bottom. Now, about choosing one of the other, web application flow is primarily designed for managing credentials on behalf of other customers. So if you have an application where you're not going to be managing accounts directly with a manager account, but instead you want to be using people's individual client account credentials to access their accounts and make API calls on their behalf, then you want to use the web application flow. Otherwise, and if you don't have a reason to do that, we strongly recommend using the installed application flow. This is where you have client accounts under a manager or MCC account in your AdWords setup, and you create one set of OAuth credentials for the manager account, and then you use those to act on behalf of the client accounts. This is a much easier way to manage authentication, since you only have one set of credentials to manage and everybody is sort of grouped into your manager account. So if you can, that's probably the better way to go. But if you're going to be doing it differently, use the web application flow to manage client credentials individually. Okay, so once you do one of those and go walk through those steps, you'll have a client ID and client secret, and you'll get a little pop-up window from the developer console telling you what they are. Record these bits of information. You're going to need both the client ID and the client secret in order to configure the client libraries to actually use OAuth and generate a refresh and access token. So these are very important. Okay, once you've done that, everything is set up. You're good to go. You should be able to use the Google Ads API. So the next step is actually making your first call. So we're going to actually go through the steps of downloading a client library, using and looking at the examples there, and then leveraging them to make an API call. So what do you need to do this? First of all, you need an approved developer token. So this, if you're an existing user of the AdWords API, hopefully you're familiar with the concept of a developer token. This is something that gets issued to AdWords developers and identifies them to the system and allows them to make API calls. You can configure and apply for a new developer token in your manager MCC account. So if you don't have a developer token, that's fine. You can actually go and enable one for test account usage right away. While there are varying access levels, like basic access or standard access, in order to be able to make calls to a test environment, you can get that pretty much right away by going to your manager MCC account. In the upper right-hand corner, click the little wrench, go to AdWords API Center, and then in there you'll find buttons and directions for how to enable API access. Click a few buttons in there and it will show you what your developer token is. Okay, you also need a client customer ID. So you basically need a client account that you're going to be making API calls to. What account are you actually trying to make changes to? So you need the client customer ID of that. And finally, you need the client ID and client secret for OAuth that we just generated in the last section. Okay, So in order to make your first API call, you want to download a client library and its associated examples, configure the client environment, and run an example. Okay, so client libraries and examples. This is a very similar setup to what we have with the AdWords API, but just at a different web address. So developers.google.com/google-ads/API/docs client libs. Google Ads API in general, the docs folder, that's our general resource for all the Google Ads API documentation. But if you go to the client libraries section, you'll see support for Java, .NET, and Ruby. We have links there under distribution to the client libraries themselves, and on GitHub, there are also example projects you can download. So they're actually separate projects. There's the client library project and the example project. I recommend, and at least for the walkthrough here, to download both, because the making your first API call that we're going to walk you through is actually running one of the examples. So actually, let's just talk a little bit about the examples that we have. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We have 6 example folders here in each one of our distribution libraries, covering the topics mentioned here. Each one of these are directories and has a bunch of examples in it. And what's actually great about this is these same exact directories live in our current AdWords API examples as well. So what you can actually do if you're looking for migration and you want to understand a little bit more in a more nuanced fashion how things have changed, literally open up one of the account management or basic operations examples in the AdWords API, find the corresponding code example in the Google Ads API, and you could literally diff them side by side, see how it's changed. We've done that on purpose. We wanted to make migration easier, so you can actually see like a before and after, see how the your code has changed and what needed to be done differently in the Google Ads API versus the AdWords API. So in account management, we have some examples on retrieving and updating AdWords account information. Advanced operations comprise advanced features like using bidding strategies and things like that. Authentication, authenticating using OAuth. So this is actually a great directory to keep track of, because we have samples in here that you can actually take your client ID and client secret configured in the previous example and generate refresh and access tokens. The AdWords, or both the AdWords and the Google Ads API client libraries handle this for you under the hood. But if you're going to be using another environment like REST, this is actually a great way to go from a client ID and client secret to a refresh or access token. So you can use the examples here to programmatically generate tokens based on your OAuth configuration for use in other areas like the client environment if you want to make a curl call to a REST endpoint, for example. So there's some really good things in the authentication folder that can be built on or used directly out of the box. Basic operations goes to things like creating, updating, or retrieving campaigns or ads. We have a reporting directory that shows you how to query stats. This is one of the major areas of the API that's had a significant change. So check out the reporting directory to see how things have changed there. And we're going to talk about that a little bit further when we get to the API concepts. And also a targeting directory talks about targeting and setting targeting on the various levels in a campaign. Okay, so configuring the client environment. Once you've downloaded one of the example folders, you want to configure the client environment. Each environment that we currently support, Java, .NET, and Ruby, has support for the same basic properties. Client ID and client secret, these are the OAuth bits that you got in the previous section. A refresh token, this, like I said, you can use the authentication examples to generate a refresh token from the client ID and client secret. So those two, plus an example from the authentication folder, gets you the refresh token, and then finally the developer token. That's the thing that you should already have, or if not, that you can get in your manager account in the AdWords UI. So go to the AdWords API Center menu in the AdWords UI, look up your developer token. In Java, there's a properties file where you can place this information very similar to how or exactly the same, almost exact, how the AdWords API works. Similar to .NET, there's an app config where you can actually configure these properties. And in Ruby, I believe it's done in code. There's a section and a preamble in the client libraries and the example code that shows exactly where you set these properties. So all 3 client environments use these properties. So basically, generate this information, copy and paste it in the appropriate spot, and then go find the get campaigns example. So in Java, it's in the basic operations folder. .NET and Ruby, same thing, just spelled in camel case a little separately, a little bit differently. But yeah, run the get campaigns example. This basically, it doesn't try to change anything, so it's a safe example to run. And it will return a list of campaigns that are in the given client customer ID account. So like I said, there's only support for search campaigns. So if the client account that you choose has other campaigns, they're not going to come back in this version of the API. So you're going to have sort of a limited view based on what the V0 version of the Google Ads API supports. Okay, or this is something new. This is something that's different from the AdWords API. You can actually use curl from the command line to issue a REST request. And this is exactly what it would look like to do the exact same thing. You'll need an OAuth access token. Now, this is actually different from the refresh token. This is the token that you get after the access, after the refresh token. So I'll go into, I'll give you a tip on how to generate that in a second. But I just want to walk through the rest of this, show you where everything else goes. You want to set the developer token. That's passed in a curl request as a header called developer-token. Set the content type. Set the Google Ads API endpoint. You'll see what it looks like here, and the next section I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about what these endpoints look like. But it's important to note that the endpoint actually includes the client customer ID. So whereas in the AdWords API, client customer ID was always sent sort of as a header in the SOAP, this is actually built in for REST. It's actually part of the URL. So it needs to be configured as part of the URL. So customer/customer ID, and then you're calling the Google Ads endpoint with a custom HTTP verb in REST parlance search. It's a post request, and you have to actually send a query. And this query is Google Ads query language. And it looks a lot like SQL, and that is not by accident. It's very SQL-like, actually more SQL-like than even the AdWords query language in the AdWords API. So you're saying select campaign ID, campaign name from campaign, order by campaign ID. And you'll get back a result that looks like the following. And it's actually a campaign object itself. And this is what I was saying. This is something that you can actually, this is the same campaign object that you would mutate. Metrics and stats come back the same way. Again, I have a slide later that's going to show it. So this is kind of this is the unified way of getting data back from the API. You issue queries like this in Google Ads query language that look very SQL-like, and you get the objects back that you asked for. And you'll notice that every campaign, every ad group, whatever it is that comes back, the object has a resource name. This is a little bit different too from how the AdWords API worked. Well, everything in the AdWords API is identified by their ID, like the customer ID, the campaign ID. Everything in the Google Ads API is primarily identified by the resource name. That's the identifier. That's sort of the top level identifier string. And it's based on the REST paradigm, and that this is the resource name that comes after the HTTP part in the REST endpoint. So you'll see, customers/campaign ID/campaigns. And if you wanted to actually do a mutate, the REST call looks very similar to that as far as the endpoint, just with an HTTP preamble. Again, the next couple slides talk about exactly what that looks like conceptually. But like I said, going back to the hint I was going to proffer here, the OAuth access token. Here's a pro tip. Use the OAuth playground to easily generate access tokens. We have a guide in our new API documentation set, similar guide we had in our AdWords API documentation. So you go to the documentation /doc/OAuth/playground. We have the OAuth playground isn't AdWords specific. It's a Google developer resource in general. But we have instructions here that are Google Ads API specific, how to configure it to generate OAuth access tokens for use in calls like this. This is a much more user-friendly and interactive way to generate these things. So I strongly recommend, at least in your development and prototyping phases, to use this, have this window open in the background when you're using things like curl to generate access tokens. It's super easy and intuitive to use. So hopefully this can make things like this much easier and make it really easy to generate OAuth access tokens. Okay, so now let's get into a little bit more detail, and I think what a lot of people actually want to hear. API concepts and overview. We're going to talk about the Google Ads API itself, how it's structured. This is, again, a lot of this is going to rhyme with what you know about the AdWords API, and that's good. That's on purpose. We're not, while we're changing the protocol and the infrastructure and modernizing everything, you're not going to have to learn a completely new way of interacting with AdWords. So a lot of this looks the same, but instead of being wrapped in SOAP, the concepts are actually elevated to REST and gRPC concepts. And we've also added, again, like some significant changes on how you query and get data objects back, which we think is going to be much more pleasant from a developer experience perspective. Okay, so resources and services. The Google Ads API consists of resources and services. These are the main building blocks of the entire API. A resource represents an AdWords entity. So a resource can be a customer, a campaign, an ad group ad, which is parlance for just an ad, anything like that. Anything in AdWords that can be represented in our data model. And again, this is similar to the AdWords API. You remember that you manipulate the same things: customers, campaigns, ad groups. So each one of those is represented as a resource in the Google Ads API, and you have each resource has a corresponding service in order to manipulate those entities. So they have very similar names, which is a service suffix on the end. So customer can be manipulated with the customer service, campaign with the campaign service, ad group ads can be with the ad group ad service. Again, this would be a familiar concept from the AdWords API. Oops, excuse me, meant to go forward, not backward. So not much is changing here, but how these are represented in the Google Ads API does look a little bit different. So going back to the resources, each AdWords entity is a top-level resource identified by its resource name. So customer has a resource name of customer / whatever the customer ID is. So the bold italicized camel case here, these are variables, and you should actually put in an actual value here in order to identify specific customers, campaigns, or ad groups. So campaign here, instead of just where in the old AdWords API you have a campaign ID to identify a campaign, now you have a resource name to identify a campaign. So a campaign is actually represented by the string customer / customer ID, campaign / whatever the campaign ID is. And the same thing goes for things like ad group ads. And I wanted to point out ad group ad here because you'll notice the ID at the end is actually a composite of two different IDs. So the underscore there is actually a literal underscore. So what you're going to have in your resource name, the end of the resource name is going to be one number underscore another number. And that's going to be the ad group ID underscore the ad ID. And that's done this way in the resource name because in AdWords, if you're a seasoned user of AdWords, you may know this. An ad ID is not necessarily unique across all customers and ad groups in AdWords. So if we just put an ad ID in there, that may not identify a unique ad. So what can uniquely identify an ad is its ad group ID and its ad ID together. So this is a way of using the existing IDs that you have in AdWords and combining them together and compositing them to come up with a resource name that uniquely identifies the entity in question here. Okay, so services. And this would hopefully shed a little bit of light on why we're naming things this way. So for each one of those entities, you have the customer service, the campaign service, the ad group ad service. Each one of these services are used to manipulate the corresponding entities. And in order to actually get their service names, on the left, these are the gRPC names for the service. On the right, these are the REST endpoints that you hit. And you see the REST endpoints are basically comprised of the resource name. So everything from HTTP all the way up to the version of the API v0 is sort of prefixed onto the front of the resource name in order to generate the endpoint. So conceptually, if you want to understand why we have all these services, like a customer service, campaign service, ad group ad service, it's the same reason as why in a REST API you have so many different endpoints for manipulating all the different things. They're actually have different endpoints, and these are the specific endpoints that you actually hit. And so they're represented in gRPC as these individual services. So this sort of hopefully can help explain and help you understand why there's sort of a proliferation of services all over the place. It's not as scary as it sounds, not as complex as it sounds, because you can think about them as sort of corresponding to a REST endpoint that represents the same thing via its resource name. Okay, so let's expand this a little bit further. Each service has methods for manipulating or getting information. So on the gRPC side, customer service has get, campaign service has get and mutate, ad group ad service has get and mutate. And looking at why this can happen is if you look over on the right side here, you have these are the HTTP verbs corresponding to what you're trying to do. So each one has a get method, and the get, as you know from REST, doesn't necessarily have anything after it. It's just the HTTP verb get. But for mutate, we actually use a custom verb here, a custom HTTP verb, or a custom REST verb, and it's made possible by putting a custom verb at the end of the URL endpoint. So for get, you would use okay, let's look at campaign service. Campaign service for get, you would use the normal endpoint with the HTTP preamble and the resource name. To call a mutate, you would actually put :mutate on the end in order to access that service. So a little bit of note here, I just want to call this out too, that the get methods are actually designed to be used sparingly for debugging or exploratory low-volume traffic. We are not designing this API in order for you to use the get methods on a regular basis. For example, if you're trying to get all the campaigns in an AdWords account, we do not want you to be using the get method to do this. We have, and this is coming up in one of the next slides, and what I've alluded to before, we have the new Google Ads query language and a unified query model in order to get massive amounts of data from the API, and that's what you should be getting. One of the reasons for that is sort of the RESTful design here and how the API works. If you, for example, have 100,000 campaigns or something like that in an AdWords account, we don't want you making 100,000 calls to different get endpoints to get all that information. That's not scalable. That's not going to do well for your service. That's not going to put a good load on our servers, and generally not efficient. We have solved for that, and we have a way for getting sort of mixed information like that that spans different sort of individual REST identification endpoints in a single service and querying batch data across a wide variety of objects. And we want you to use that instead of the get endpoints. So before we get that, just a quick note on how you make changes and mutate objects. A service's mutate method is something that accepts both a customer ID and a list of operations. This is very similar to how the AdWords API works. The Google Ads API doesn't change that. It just changes a little bit the format on how that works. So you submit the customer ID. So in the REST call, that's as part of the actual service name, part of the URL. In the campaign service, and using the gRPC interface, you pass the customer ID and a list of operations. And the good thing, the thing to note is the operations is actually an array, and it can actually contain a whole bunch of operations. There you can have create, update, or remove operations. So for a campaign, you can create campaigns, update existing campaigns, or remove campaigns, all in a single API call, and you can do a whole bunch of them at once. So you want to batch them together in a single mutate, and this is one of the reasons that we structured the service like this, so it's efficient. You can actually do a lot of operations in a single call instead of having to make individual calls to a whole bunch of API endpoints individually. So you can actually create a new budget here in this example, 234 in the pause state, and also remove a budget in the same API call by specifying its resource name. Okay, let's get to retrieving data with the Google Ads service. This is one of the crown jewels of the new API, and one of the things that I think is going to make everybody's life a lot easier from a developer workflow perspective and developer efficiency. We have a service called the Google Ads service. Now, this is a little bit of a unique service because, like I said, with the other services, a lot of them have corresponding resources for manipulating them. Google Ads service doesn't have a resource. It's a service on its own, and it's designed to be the unified object retrieval and reporting service for the Google Ads API. It doesn't have a get method. It doesn't have a mutate method. What it has is a search method, which allows you to pull back data from the API. And the REST endpoint correspondingly looks like this. You specify the customer ID you're calling this for, Google Ads : search. And that allows you to make a query against the Google Ads service. Now, the Google Ads query language is what you use to make queries here, and it looks a lot like SQL. This is analogous to the AdWords query language that we have in the AdWords API, but there are some changes. It's not exactly the same. One of the things is a little bit more SQL-like, but we have a full guide on how this works. So I'd urge you to take if you're interested in sort of the nitty-gritty and the language definition and all that, we have that on our guide on the developer site. Please go take a look at that. It's some really cool, interesting stuff there. It allows you to query and retrieve combined attribution objects across all entities. So an example query actually would look like this. This is an example query you can actually make to an account, and it works. Select campaign name, campaign status, device, and then there's a whole metrics section here where you can actually get impressions, clicks, CTR, average CPR, cost from campaign during the last, where date is during the last 30 days. So you get back a series of objects called Google Ads rows, and each one of them represents sort of a snapshot of this information. And you get a Google Ads row for one per campaign that matched your where clause in this query here. And you'll notice that you have campaign, device, and metrics object in the Google Ads row. And these correspond to sort of the objects that you asked for in the select statement. One of the key things to notice here is the campaign object. This is the exact object that you would get back if you did the thing that I said is not something we want you to do frequently. But if you made a GET call to one of the RESTful endpoints or a GET call to the campaign service, this is the exact object that would come back. This is also the exact object that you would send to the mutate method of the campaign service in order to make a change. So you get that alongside device desktop and a metrics object that encapsulates the different stats that you asked for. And so the super cool part about this is once you have this, you can actually pass the campaign object embedded in each one of these Google Ads rows back to the campaign service mutate. So say you wanted to pause all the campaigns that met this, that came back in this query. You wanted to find all the campaigns in the last 30 days, say that had clicks above 20. You can actually inspect the metrics object, and in this object here in the example has 27 clicks. Say, okay, that's enough. Send back the campaign object with the status change to pause directly to the campaign service. You don't have to parse out the Google Ads row from, say, CSV or something like that and reconstitute a campaign object, build that up yourself, and call the campaign service, which is what you would have to do if you were using the AdWords API to do something similar. So this is a huge, important difference, and we think it's going to make developers' lives a lot easier. So please, as you're going through and experimenting with the Google Ads API, please try this out. Let us know how it works or doesn't work, or if you like the workflow, what would make your life easier, stuff like that. But we think this is going to be a very strong feature that's going to benefit a lot of people. Okay, so one other thing while we're on the topic of reporting is criteria metrics. So while we have the concept of being able to issue sort of arbitrary SQL statements and get information back, what about performance data that corresponds to criteria-based reports? For instance, the keywords performance report, or in AdWords, there's a whole bunch of reports similar to that, like the age range performance report, or a whole slew of others that sort of provide a predefined view of the data based on certain criteria metrics. We want to be able to give Google Ads API users a way to get those reports so they don't have to build them themselves with SQL statements and have a unified view of the same reports that are offered in AdWords. And the way we do that is exposing these individual criteria reports as view objects. And these are actually a resource, a top-level resource, just like Campaign is a resource, Ad Group is a resource. So for instance, the keyword performance report in the AdWords is represented by something called the keyword view resource in the API. Excuse me. And the reason we do that is it allows you to actually query them with the Google Ads service and use them as a target in the from clause of the SQL. So to query the keyword or the keyword performance report in AdWords programmatically, the Google Ads API exposes this thing called the keyword view resource. And you would use the Google Ads service. You use the exact same Google Ads query language format that you use to get metrics like in the previous example, but you can actually target in the from clause the keyword view to get the same metrics and same criteria view as that corresponds to that report. So you can get impressions, clicks, CTR during the last 30 days from the keyword view. And notice here that you can also get associated objects. So in the documentation for these various resource types, including the views, we have a list of associated objects that can be pulled back with queries like this. So you can actually pull back campaign, ad group, and ad group criteria insofar as they're related to the view. So if you also want to get, say, the campaign name, ad group name, stuff like that, you can do that, and they come back just like in the previous example, encapsulated in campaign and ad group objects and ad group criterion objects, as you can see on the right side here, which are full-fledged API entities that can be used in the corresponding services. So you have a very flexible return format that allows you to use the return data programmatically in your code and in other API calls. And you also have a way to get that data in a fashion that makes it consistent with defined report types in AdWords without having to try to figure those out yourself and issue arbitrary SQL statements to sort of reverse engineer them. So this is sort of how we're going to expose the different reports to you in the Google Ads API. The only one that exists in V0 is this keyword view that corresponds to, go back a slide here to show you, this corresponds here to the keyword performance report. But as we roll out incremental updates, we're going to have others that represent the other performance reports in AdWords. So you'll have more views like this to use as incremental features get rolled out. Okay, so I think that sort of wraps up the overview of the API. I just want to present here a slide of resources that we have. Again, I know this is a video and this isn't the greatest format because you can't actually click these, but I promise you we will be publishing these slides. Maybe we'll do a blog post or something after the fact to let you know when a video of this presentation and the slides are posted, and these will be clickable. But I'll leave this up here for a second just to point out some of the key areas where you can get support. I think the main one is the very first one. If you're going to write down anything, or developers.google.com/Google Ads/API/docs start. That's the starting point for our Google Ads API developer site, and everything in the left column is in there somewhere. So if you start there, you can get to all these. But I wanted to call out some key resources here that I think are going to be particularly important. First of all is the migration guide. That's designed to facilitate migrating from the AdWords API to the new Google Ads API. And that has a lot of things in there highlighting what's changed, what's stayed the same. If you want to do this and you were doing it before, here's how you make changes. So the migration guide is an excellent resource for trying to understand what's changed and how your product and your existing code is going to need to change in order to migrate to the Google Ads API. We have the API reference itself. Right now, it covers and is focused primarily on gRPC because our client libraries use gRPC. So for Java, .NET, and C#, the existing client libraries, that's how you get to the gRPC interface. Use those client libraries and you use gRPC. We're exploring filling that out as the beta program matures with RESTful documentation. So that access point and that way of using the API is also documented. But right now, you're just going to find the gRPC reference. We have the client libraries and code examples. Their main page on the developer site is here under API/doc/client_libs. And most of those link out to corresponding pages on GitHub, where you can find examples, projects, and the client libraries. Another thing is the release notes. This highlights exactly what's in a certain release. These are going to be important as we release, V01, V02, and our incremental releases to the beta program. You're going to be able to find exactly what's been added, exactly what new support. We now have support for shopping campaigns or display campaigns, whichever campaigns you're interested in. Check the release notes as you release incremental releases. What exactly is showing up and when is going to be in there. And finally, the Google Ads query language documentation. We have a guide here with multiple sections that talks about exactly how it works. It highlights the syntax. It shows what it's capable of. So please look at that because, like I said, this is sort of front and center in the new API. This is how you get data back for reporting, for other services, for the whole API in general. So it's going to be very important to understand how that works. Okay, so on the right column here, API platform and protocol buffers. This is sort of some more meta documentation, not specific to the Google Ads API, but specific to the architecture and how it's built. So if you want to understand a little bit of the gRPC versus REST design philosophy, why we built the API the way we did, check out our Cloud API Design Guide, cloud.google.com/APIs/design. This is a common document that sort of outlines the architecture and design of all our Google Cloud APIs. And the Google Ads API, fits right in. So if you're trying to understand why we made certain decisions, why does it look like this, why is it exposed this way, this is a great way to actually get your head conceptually around why the API works and looks the way it does. I myself have gone back to this API design guide a number of times playing with the Google Ads API, and everything makes a lot more sense, and it puts everything in perspective. I had a lot of moments, when I've looked at this guide. So check that out, encourage it. And also the protocol buffers developer guide. So if you're looking in our client libraries and trying to understand the nitty gritty on why certain things are the way they are in code, especially, for example, in our Java client library, where some of the value classes, for example, when you pass strings back and forth on the API, they have wrappers around them called string value classes. Why is it like that? Well, this has to do with protocol buffers, because under the scenes we're using protocol buffers, and that's sort of the lingua franca. That's how the client libraries communicate with the API. So if you want to understand some of the more nitty-gritty specifics on and some of the wrapper classes that we use, for example, in our client environments, the protocol buffer developer guide goes a long way to explaining how all that stuff works. Finally, getting support. For the Google Ads API and the beta program in particular, we're going to have the dedicated email support for everybody in the beta program. So if you need to get somebody on the directly on the line, if you need somebody from our support team to answer a specific question or solve a pressing problem, please reach out directly to us at AdWordsAPI-support@google.com. That will go to our team of support engineers, and someone will get back to you within a day or two. We have a pretty quick turnaround there, and we will actually get a person on the line who will be able to help you answer your problem, get things sorted out over email. We also have the Google Ads API forum, also known as the existing AdWords API forum, where you can post questions to the larger developer community and have a sort of communal group response. Our engineering team also manages moderates that forum and also hovers there. So if you do have questions there, it's not a complete community-supported resource. We do have engineers that lurk on that forum and can answer things there and help out there. So you do get sort of first-rate interaction with our team as well by posting things there, with the added benefit of anybody else in the community who may be able to solve that problem or has seen something like that before. So, okay, I think I've left this up and talked about this long enough. Hopefully you've got an idea here. Again, we're going to publish these slides. All these links will be clickable once we have this deck up and shareable with everybody. Okay, now I'm going to switch over to the Q&A. So let's see, the first one that has the most upvotes so far. Start with that one. How long will the current AdWords API be supported? That is actually a great question. Right now, we don't have any sort of timeline for either deprecation or a shutdown of the AdWords API. Both APIs are going to be supported for the time being side by side through 2018 as the beta program progresses. There is going to be a time when the beta program progresses and becomes not a beta and becomes full 1.0, and the Google Ads API and the AdWords API will exist side by side. We don't have an exact timeline on when that's going to happen. It may happen later this year or early into next year, but we're trying to get this done as quickly as we can because we know everybody's excited about this. Exact dates we don't have, but we will share them when they become available, probably on the blog, and get those out to everybody. After that, like I said, we don't have a timeline for anything related to the current AdWords API either going into a deprecation mode or being shut down or anything like that. So for the time being, both APIs are going to be supported side by side. Okay, second question here. Why remove the reporting service? The new way was how it was 4 years ago, so why switch back? This is actually a very, very good question, and if you're a longtime user of the AdWords API, this is a very, very astute observation. For those of you who don't know, long time ago, aka 4 years ago, the existing AdWords API actually allowed you to get reporting metrics and objects together in a similar fashion to how you can do it with the new Google Ads API. For example, you can call the campaign service in the existing AdWords API 4 years ago, and along with getting the campaign name, the campaign status, you can actually in your selector say you wanted to get impressions, clicks, things like that, and they would come back. You'd have your campaign service would return to you a campaign object that had an impressions field on it, and you can actually get impressions and clicks and something like that. So why are we going back to that when we sort of we consciously switched away from that to our sort of dedicated, reporting services. One of the reasons that there are benefits for having it that way, and we recognize those. However, the way that it's being done now is actually slightly different than how it was 4 years ago. 4 years ago, those impressions, click stats, those metrics were being returned directly on the objects themselves, not as sort of part of the request, but separate. So if you notice the slides that I presented, when you get a Google Ads row back from the Google Ads search, the Google Ads Service search method, you get the campaign object, for example, and you get a metrics object that encapsulates all the metrics side by side. So you can use the campaign object directly again. When in the old way, the impressions, clicks, and everything were fields on that object. So you couldn't take a campaign, for example, a campaign object that had an impressions field and pass that to Mutate, because the Mutate service would think you're trying to set impressions equal, say, 44 or something like that, and that wouldn't work. So the design is, while it's similar, it's not quite the same. And also there are some scalability issues for doing it back then. We didn't have the page data response support that we do now. We didn't have the infrastructure, so it made it very difficult to combine the reporting endpoints with the SOAP endpoints from an infrastructure point of view. Now that everything is sort of brand new based on a modern infrastructure design for massively scaled data and page data across all our services, that's no longer an issue. So I guess this is a very long-winded way of saying we recognize the advantages of having it that way. And while we couldn't do it 4 years ago because of some object model constraints and also some infrastructure constraints, we've solved for those. And we think we have a really good solution. It's sort of the best of both worlds now. Okay, let's see. Here's another one that has a bunch. Will the new API support YouTube video campaigns? This is also a very, very good question that we get a lot. We know that there's a lot of people asking for this. I don't have an answer for this. We don't have any plans currently to support API YouTube video campaigns via the API, but we know it's a common feature request and there's a lot of people asking for it. So stay tuned. If we have any announcements about this, we will make them available as soon as we can. But as of right now, we don't have any plans to make any announcements about YouTube video campaign support in the new API. Let me just scroll through here to see if there's anything. Okay, I think I've covered most of the questions that had a lot of upvotes. Let's go to some of the other questions. Here's another question that was asked earlier, ahead of time. How do I enable logging in the new client libraries? That's also a very good question. As of right now, you don't. Right now, we don't have support for logging to be enabled like we do in the AdWords API client libraries. That's coming. That's just a beta feature. That's just something that we haven't gotten to yet because everything is so brand new. We are looking into ways to enable logging so you can actually flip a switch and you can have your requests and responses logged to the console or a file, just like you do with our existing AdWords API client libraries. So while we don't have support for that in the V0 release of the client libraries, please stay tuned. We know that's important, and that will be coming soon. Okay, this is another good question. Should the new API be used in production while it's still in beta? This is another pre-question that we had. If not, do you have an estimate for when it will be ready for production use? This is great and a good thing to know. This is a beta program, and we do not recommend using the beta in production because things can change. Things will change. Services will be added. Things may not quite work. We can't guarantee the level of stability between releases that we can with a production API. So please don't use this until it comes out of beta. That being said, when will it come out of beta? I don't have an estimate for you on that. We will let you know, but the plan is hopefully later this year sometime we will get this out of beta. But we don't have an exact date or timeline that we can share yet. So please stay tuned. As we have announcements, we'll share those on the blog and our formal communication channels. Also, another question that was asked previously is, will we be releasing a PHP client library? Yes, absolutely we will. We have Java, .NET, and Ruby now. The next incremental release hopefully should contain PHP and Python, and there may be support for further languages down the road as more incremental releases come out. But yes, PHP client library support is coming and should be a fast follow in one of these next incremental beta releases. So keep your eyes peeled, and you should have that arriving very, very shortly. This goes to, will there be a Python client library? Somebody asked. Yes, there should be a Python client library, and hopefully that will be coming right around the same time. So that should hopefully be coming soon. That's a good one. Can we use a hybrid of AdWords API and new Google Ads API based on what features are supported by the new API? Yes, actually you can, and that's a great point that I should have made earlier. There's no strict wall between these APIs. They can be used side by side. So if you're using the AdWords API and you want to try out some features of the Google Ads API, you can use them both side by side in sort of a heterogeneous environment. You can make some calls to Google Ads API. You can make some calls to the AdWords API. So while in the previous question I said that you should not be making these calls in production for the beta yet, that's still true, and you shouldn't. If there are features though that you want to experiment with, and maybe you want to experiment with them in your existing production deployment, you can do that. Just know and sort of bolt on some Google Ads API calls aside your AdWords API calls. That's fine, but just be aware that those calls that you're making are considered beta calls. So maybe do that in a sandbox environment or something like that, where you're not putting sort of a production load on that feature set, at least not yet. So great question, yes. And also when this is also a good point to make for when the API comes out of beta. The Google Ads API will come out of beta. There will be a version 1.0 at some point, and this constraint will still hold, meaning you can use them both together. And that's actually going to be a very good migration strategy. You don't have to do a cold turkey migration from the AdWords API all the way to the Google Ads API at once. You can do it in an incremental fashion. If there's some features of the Google Ads API you want to start using right away, once we hit 1.0 and you want to start a migration, you can implement those features in the Google Ads API immediately and keep everything else in the AdWords API and sort of have a split deployment. That is going to be something that's fully supported and probably a best practice. That's going to be something we're going to be encouraging people to do. There's no reason that you need to completely switch from one or the other. You can migrate services and pieces of your application as they make sense and prioritize which ones you want to do at what time. So excellent question here, and that is a resounding yes. Okay, is there a restriction of either features or performance with the REST API instead of gRPC? Okay, so there is no feature restriction. Every API endpoint is going to have a corresponding REST API endpoint. So there shouldn't be any difference in what features you can access between using gRPC or REST. Performance, gRPC is designed to be a high-performance protocol that operates over HTTP2 using protocol buffers, which are also designed for performance. So I would say, well, I don't have any metrics to back this up, and this is sort of off the cuff. I expect the gRPC to be better performing overall. However, the REST API, that's not to say that the REST API is a low-performance endpoint. Absolutely not. It's a peer to the gRPC endpoint, and either one is fine. So I think that the generic answer is there isn't any restriction or feature or performance over either one. But in general, gRPC is designed for performance, and it may be a better choice when you actually profile your code to see what's going on underneath the hoods. And how that actually works. gRPC probably will lead to some performance gains, but it's not going to be a giant game-changing performance leap in that would make the REST API unusable. And also, the gRPC is what we're building our client libraries around. So you're going to have additional client library support. If you're developing in Java, .NET, Ruby, soon to be Python, soon to be PHP, if you're already going to be developing in those client environments, I would strongly recommend using the gRPC client libraries, because we've done a lot of the work for you regarding OAuth, a lot of the scaffolding to make the API work that you would otherwise have to rebuild yourself if you're using REST. So there's essentially no need not to use the gRPC endpoint. So please use the gRPC endpoint. But from a feature completeness and performance comparison, they're going to be pretty close to each other. Let's see. There was one. I just resorted the questions and lost the one I was just going to show. Where did it go? Here we go. This is the question. I sorted them based on the thumbs up, and then I lost it. Okay, here we go. As you know, the account balance value is not available in the current API. Okay, so I think what you're referring to here is knowing how many operations that you've made. So if you're using basic API access, whether having to know how many operation calls you made so you can make sure that your API usage is under quota. If I'm misunderstanding that, please post another question. But so as we know, the account balance value is not available in the current API. Is that supported in the new beta API? That's a great question. I don't believe it currently is, but I think we should get that support there as the beta program progresses, as we have new incremental releases. But the V0 release that's in the wild right now, I believe does not have any support for showing you sort of the account quota that you've used already. So, okay, that one. So that the answer to this question is not yet, but it should be there as we approach feature parity in one of the future incremental releases. Okay, so I think I've answered all the questions here. I'm just going to look. If anybody has any other questions right now or anything, put it in the chat real quick. I can see it, but I think, oh, here's one. This one. I was avoiding this one because it was a big question, complex. I was going to get to it at the end, and now we're at the end. Okay, so this is a question that somebody asked ahead of time. Some of our customers need segmented reports for specific campaigns. A query like select date metrics impressions from customer where date during last 30 days results in an error. The following field must be present in select campaign name. Is this supported? So in general, yes, we should be able to support segmented reports in the new API. And I think the way to do that is going to be using the Google Ads query language like this to sort of use the SQL construct to segment those reports accordingly. And I think this particular error here, saying that this statement needs campaign name in the select is slightly a different issue, because if you run this query, you're going to get a whole bunch of date and metrics. You're going to get a whole bunch of Google Ads rows back, each one with a date and metrics. And you're not going to get anything identifying which campaign it belongs to. So you're going to get like 10 objects, date metrics, date metrics, date metrics. You have no way to know which one of those corresponds to which campaign. So what this error is telling you that you need in the select statement, you also need some sort of identifying information. So when you page through that result set, you know that, okay, this date and this impression count is for campaign X, campaign Y, campaign Z. So in this case, I think following the advice of the error message and putting campaign name in there, hopefully shouldn't change anything. Now, if you're trying to get just in general for over an entire account, if you're trying to get a view of dates, metrics, and impressions over an entire account for an entire customer, I think this is where things like the different views will come in, using the different view reports in order to get those metrics. So I don't think you'll have the same restriction over using one of the view reports. So while I think in this case, I understand. Okay, so I understand now that this is trying to get them over for an entire customer, so for like an account level report. So I see why the campaign, why you don't want to put the campaign in there. I get it now. Okay, so I answered a different question at the beginning of this question, and now I understand better what you were asking. So yes, the answer to this is a very long-winded way of saying yes, we should be able to support queries like this, and whether it's removing this restriction or using a soon-to-be-released view, we will let you know, and we will actually add that to our reporting guide to make it exactly clear how you can get customer level segmented reports like this. So yes, this is supported. Let me find out exactly why this particular error is surfacing here. It may be because you need some sort of identifying information regarding the customer in the select statement as well. But either way, this type of query is supported. We can troubleshoot exactly how to issue that query to the new Google Ads API sort of offline. But yes, segmented customer level metrics that correspond to account level reports are supported. Okay. Okay, here's another one that was asked earlier. The current AdWords API supports two methods of managing ad extensions, extension setting services and the feed services. Will both also be offered in the Google Ads API? This is a great question. I can generally say that feeds are going to be in the new Google Ads API, and the concept of feeds and managing your feeds the way you do in the AdWords API isn't going to be changing. We will likely have support for the extension setting services, but I cannot guarantee that right now. So all I can sort of guarantee is feed services are going to be there in some fashion, and we're working in implementing the support for those right now. So this is great feedback for us too, to know that the extension setting services there's demand for that, and I would think that as we approach, our goal here is feature parity. So I don't think we're going to be losing any functionality. So whether that means the exact extension setting service is going to be there, or some analogous method that corresponds to the extension setting service, that remains to be seen. So overall, yes, they should be there, but what form they will take when the feed features are actually rolled out is sort of to be determined. So stay tuned, and we should have more information about that as the feed services get implemented in a future incremental release of the API. Okay, here's another question that was just asked. Will the Google Ads query language support the group by feature? That's a good question. I'm not sure yet. Possibly. So that's a very good question that I actually don't know. If the feature isn't there now, then it's something that may show up and it may not. I don't have an exact answer for what's going to show up in Google Ads query language as the feature evolves. But if there's going to be a need for it, particularly in relation to the last question about segmenting data, then we may have a group by construct or something similar in order to aggregate data like that. But so the current answer is, if it's not there, if anything's not in Google Ads query language now, I don't know. So let's table that, and it's something to be determined. So as we increment on the feature and iterate on it, I'm sure there will be changes and additions to the language construct, but right now I don't know what those will be. Let's see, do we have anything else? Okay, I think that covers all the questions. So thank you very much. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope we got all your questions and that this was answered and this was useful. If not, let me just go back here and just display this one more time. The getting support in the bottom right. Please reach out to us directly at AdWords API-support if you have any questions about the beta program, or reach out to the forum and stay tuned there for any announcements, and also the Google Ads developer blog, where we will be making future sort of product release announcements as the incremental versions of the beta API get rolled out. So thank you very much for tuning in. I'm going to switch back to myself here and just say thank you very much, and hopefully this was very useful. We will talk soon, because I think we will have future webinars on similar subjects as we have more API features to discuss. So thank you very much. Take care.